doing well, kind of considering, but we're trying to find um, balance kind of with everything that he has going on to make sure that we're supporting him every way that we can. That he doesn't get yeah, it's challenging. But he's been such a valuable member of our team for such a long time that I want to do everything we can for him. So we're looking at different things that we can do to make things a little easier for him. Yeah, so we'll be hiring for a couple of PPO positions soon. So yeah, anyone you have that either think would be good or think know somebody would be good. Send them my way. Yeah, very good. Great.
There's our AV guy. Didn't you make this one hot? Oh, everything's hot. You can hear me. Not very loud. Okay, now we're on. All right. Hello, everyone. Trying to keep everybody awake after lunch. Did everybody enjoy lunch? That was pretty good. Anybody see the drone taxi down there? You guys went down to the exhibit hall? That is amazing. What an example of the future of personal mobility, right? All right, so we're going to start. I want you guys, how many people here were born after, say, 1970? Were there a lot of people here born after 1980? Wow, okay. I'm really feeling old now. All right, so let's go back in your brain, say, 15 years ago. When you thought about personal mobility, what did you think about? Raise your hand. When you thought about personal mobility, what were you thinking about?
Control.
Control. Okay. 69 Camaro. Takes me back to high school. Okay. Anything else? How about?
The James Bond convertible plane to car.
Wow. Okay. Yes, I do. Yeah. Not such a distant thought now. Anybody else? Thinking about cars mostly, it sounds like. You're thinking about cars when you think about personal mobility. Now, when you think about personal mobility today, what are you thinking about? Thoughts?
Bicycles?
Bicycles? Walking. Okay, that's been around since humanity. But you're right. People thinking about that. What other things are we thinking about? Personal mobility. Debbie?
Well, I was having a bad thought about just being able to continue to walk as you get older.
Yeah. Accessibility. Anything else? Okay, Will? Uber. Yep. Things are really changing. When I think about personal mobility, how many of you had any experience on an e-scooter or an e-bike? Few of it. Yep. I have a metal plate in my arm as a result of an e-scooter. I just want to share that. But still, they're out there. And then this. Who would have thought 20 years ago that when we were talking about personal mobility, this is what we would be thinking about? And so things have changed so dramatically just in 15 years. And then those of you who saw the presentation yesterday morning, mind-blowing about what the future is going to look like. So that's our job today, is to really think about what the future of personal mobility is going to look like. And then as professionals, what we all can be doing to plan for that revolution. So we have two incredible speakers with us today who are going to help us with that. And we're going to start with Ryan Westrom, who is with Ford Smart Mobility. Now, Ford Smart Mobility was started in 2016 to design, build, grow, and invest in emerging mobility services. Ryan is their East Coast head of engagement, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So come on up to the podium, and please welcome Ryan.
Thank you, Nina. I am thrilled to be here in the Triangle, and it's actually that introduction was basically perfect because I feel like that's kind of a marker of my career. Like the very first portion of so I've been in transportation my entire life. I'm a transportation engineer and an urban planner, and the first portion of my career was very much in that world that we knew how to do that transportation that was pretty consistent from the 1960s through on into this century, right? And that's what we knew how to do really well. And honestly, that works really well. It's put the United States in the forefront of the world economy. The interstate highway system was something that Eisenhower allowed. I don't think he recognized the impact that it was going to have economically. And the ability to move people and goods around our country is really second to none. Our freight railroad system is something that is unmatched, right? But as we move into the 21st century, are we going to be able to maintain our place in that sphere, right? And the first portion of my career really was matching the way we had done things. And now, as was already intimated so well, things are shifting in major ways. And with that comes opportunity, but also, of course, it comes risk. And so I just wanted to spend a couple minutes, and neither one of us really have slides. We're just going to do some introductory comments, and we look forward to good conversation about this topic. But I just wanted to take a couple minutes to kind of contextualize where we are at as we move into the 21st century, and do that by looking a little bit back at history. So going back even much further than that. And so my firm, I think most of you know who Ford is. It's a company that's been around. And the Model T, you go back to the 1920s, was really the first form of personal mobility, what we're talking about today, that was available to the masses. And we're very proud of that heritage, and that's something that we want to hang on to. And as we explore things that are more on the mobility side, thinking about those things that would be something that is available to the same sort of democratization of the masses sort of concept is really important to us. But it actually goes much further back than that. So if you think about human history, in the early 1800s, let's think back to the beginning of the 19th century, almost everybody lived in rural areas, right? And so the majority of people did not live in cities. And most people got around by horse if they were wealthy, but by just moving around on foot, right? And they didn't stray far. You guys have probably heard statistics where the average person didn't move further than 25 miles from where they were born their entire life, right? And that was your world, and that's what you knew. And communication moved that quickly as well, right? So the ability to communicate from one person to another moved about as fast as humans could move. The fastest that communication could move was on a horse, right? And so we know about the Pony Express and things like that, a heritage of moving mail in our country. But that was how communication moved. And so the first industrial revolution, so in the 1810s to 1820s, is brought about by the combination of steam and steel, right? So these two innovations, so technological innovations, changed the course of human history. So that's why we all know about the notion of industrial revolutions, because of that first big one. And what happens is steam and steel combine to allow railroads. With railroads, human communication can move faster than it ever had before in human history. All of a sudden, humans could communicate across hundreds of miles as opposed to just tens of miles. And what happens over the decades that follow, of course, industry takes off and people start to urbanize. Just a decade ago, or 12 years ago, more than 50% of the world now is living in cities. Most of you probably live in what would be considered a city by the way we count these stats. That wasn't the case then, and this industry allowed that, because what happens is, over the decades after those innovations, railroad towns form up. The stops that these railroads make are where cities start to conglomerate. And with that growth comes the need for new technology and new innovation. And so the 19th century was full of this urbanizing, full of this industrializing, and the population of the world starts to take off because there's synergy in humans working together. There's an agglomeration benefit that happens when we all work together. And I could go long into that, but I won't, because I'm going to skip forward 100 years, because the second industrial revolution is waiting at the beginning of the 20th century. And so all of a sudden, electricity and the thought of innovating to allow mass production, allow the production of the Model T, and allow the coming together of industry in a new way that electricity, you guys can all understand how big that was for factories and the growth that we saw. And so again, we have another pivot point in kind of human history where we take off again. And that force also drives us towards urbanization. And my theory is that that's continuing, because here we are again, now another 100 years later. And whether you call it the third or the fourth industrial revolution, or kind of call them one together, we're at the same sort of precipice. And so now it's digital technology. So computing power is allowing us to communicate in ways that we never have been able to before. You held up your iPhone. I will always remember how old the iPhone is, because it was released the same month as my oldest daughter. And so I know exactly how old the iPhone is, 12 years and about 3 months. And it's an amazing piece of technology, and it's changing the way we do business. And that's really the marker of, kind of in my career, when things started to shift. All of a sudden, a few years later, Uber and Lyft come about. And we're doing all these things. But what is interesting to think about is the pace of these changes. And this is where I'll stop after this because I could probably go on forever. But the pace is where it starts to get really interesting. And if you look back in that first industrial revolution, it was decades in the making, the shifts that happened in the world. So over decades, the morphology of place shifts and these railroad towns form up. I mean, it wasn't until the 1880s to the 1900s that the city started to look like what we kind of remember. Then with electricity and mass production, it's still on the order of a decade or more. Like by World War II, it had really taken hold, and that was a couple decades. But it was still more like decades that it's impacting. But all of a sudden now, it happens much more quickly, and here's why. Because we all have direct access to the technology that's changing the world now. So almost everybody in here, I imagine, has a cell phone sitting in their pocket. Less than basically a decade after they were invented. In fact, you probably had it just a few years after it was invented. We all have access to digital technology. And yet, the physical world we live in isn't that quick to react. And so we know that changing the physical world is still going to take decades. You point back to how it was in 1980, and a lot of the roads felt very similar. A lot of the infrastructure that we're installing, there's traffic signals in Raleigh that I'm sure predate 1980, right? And so we're stuck in a physical environment that hasn't kept pace with our digital environment. And we as humans start to feel that disconnect. And it doesn't always feel good, actually. Like we struggle, like we talk bad about what this technology is doing to our lifestyle because we feel like it's moving at a pace that's quicker than we're comfortable with. And part of that is the physical world can't move at that pace. And I think that challenge is the crux of the challenge that we're facing as we try and think about what are the ramifications for personal mobility in this industrial revolution. Because on each one of those prior industrial revolutions, there was a transportation outcome that basically was the effect of that industrial revolution that changed. And as I said at the beginning, it was railroads for the first, the Model T, I would say, for the second industrial revolution. What is it going to be for the third, the industrial revolution that we're in right now? What is digital technology going to mean for personal mobility? And getting that right and making it very human-centered and allowing all of us to feel more human and allowing us to pursue who we are is the challenge that's before us. And I think that's the challenge that we're trying to get right. So with that bit of history and bringing it forward, I'll turn it over to Julie and look forward to talking more about what exactly that push is going to lead us to. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. And we're going to talk in our question and answers about what does that mean? What is Ford looking at? What's on the horizon? Before I turn the podium over to Julie, I want to remind everybody who has a smartphone. Raise your hand. So everybody got the app? Okay. So I'm just reminding you to follow your app and answer the questions in terms of the survey and whatnot regarding our session. I appreciate it. All right. So now we're going to turn the podium over to Julie Herney, who is from Streetlight Data. And that company aims to put big data to work for transportation planning, processing trillions of data points to analyze how vehicles, bikes, pedestrians, and everything else interact in our transportation system. Juliet is the director of the Southeast region. So please help me in joining Juliet to the podium.
So I have to jump up to see if you guys can hear me. It's not made for the short people like myself. Can you guys hear me okay? Everybody awake from after lunch? Welcome. I'm Julie Herney. I'm with Streetlight Data. I've been with the company for about 3 years. I'm based up in Fairfax, Virginia, and work out of my house and travel along the southeast. So basically from Delaware down to Florida over to Mississippi, working with transportation professionals like you guys, helping you understand and answer transportation questions and understand how people are coming from or going to over different places within your communities over different periods of time. And we do that for bikes, we do that for pedestrians, we do that for cars and trucks. Transit's coming soon. Hopefully we'll have a mode for scooters and so forth and flying taxis. That should be along the way as well. But just want to take a quick raise of hands. How many other people are like me, are proud transportation nerds? Raise your hands. Come on. You know you are. I know you're out there. Okay. So I had never worked for a government before, and I never worked for transportation before up to 3 years ago, but got the bite when talking with Laura Schul, who is our founder. And she was just so passionate about what she did. And she was talking about how you can use big data. I've been involved with data and big data and analytics and SaaS-based solutions for about the last 20 years. In fact, I got my first bite with technology here when I lived in the Triangle for 12 years in Raleigh and worked for a company called Ganymede Software. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but it was 4 former IBMers that came together to put together a network platform testing solution, and I went to work for them, and they taught me about the protocol stack. And if they can teach me that, I can do about anything. So that's where I got my first taste of technology. What Streetlight does, though, is we, again, work with transportation professionals, helping them answer questions. And we use that by using big data from mobile phone devices. So 2 different sources of our data, the first of which is GPS, which we get from our partner INRIX. And that's coming from connected cars and trucks and fleet management systems. So understanding how trucks are moving in and out of places. One example of use for that was understanding how do you separate port trucks from regular trucks. So the DOT might be able to tell you that there's trucks, how many trucks are moving around a system, but Hampton Roads TPO, for example, the MPO up in Hampton Roads, wanted to be able to see what percentage were port trucks. Because they wanted to know what routes they were taking when they were leaving Hampton Roads and going up to destinations all over the country. What distribution centers were they going to? How long did it take them? When were they traveling? And so forth. And being able to parse out port trucks enabled them to be able to also prioritize the projects that they had. They had more multimodal projects than they could actually pay for. So how did they pick which ones to fund? So by understanding what percentage were trucks versus regular trips, they were able to see those trips and the routes they were taking and use their 3-legged stool. One of those 3 legs had 100 points, and they're able to take 10 of those 100 points and give it to projects that would take more trips off the road to alleviate congestion. So by understanding those that were funding port travel, they're able to accurately fund the project and give the most bang to the buck for those projects that were going to help the community most. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah, so think about that too also for regular trips. Most recently I've been working with DCHC MPO here in the city of Durham. They started working with us last year on a project that they did with Alta Planning. They wanted to be doing a project for downtown Durham to understand what were the percentage of trips that people that were coming externally and traveling into downtown Durham. What was the length of the trip they took? What was the simple trip purpose? What was the demographic percentage of all those people that were traveling? And they could do all that through their desktop. So we work with their teams to give them access to the desktop. In a number of clicks, they pick the type of data that they want to use, and they can put in things like the time of day that they want to use, the date period going back as far as 2014. So you can get archival information, get before and after looks, and understand how people are moving around your community. So from working with them, then they started talking with their friends over at Campo, which is the MPO for here in Raleigh. And since they share a travel demand model, they wanted to be able to have access throughout the whole area of both MPOs. So they use our data to validate and calibrate the model as they're planning for the next 5 years or as many as 30 years and beyond to understand how people are coming from or going to any points throughout your community. We also work with DT. My role is working with DOTs, MPOs, and municipalities throughout the country. So any kind of questions you want to answer as far as corridor improvements, if you want to do travel demand management, if you want to validate or calibrate a model, or simply just get turning movements for an intersection in your community, you can get all that from Streetlight data, both through the GPS, or you can use location-based services data, which comes from cell phones. Everybody in here has a cell phone. How many of you guys have a weather app on your phone? Right, so that's where we're getting information from, is we work with a company called Cubic that works with gas apps, weather apps, dating apps, what have you, that's using your location to better serve you. So we get information on roughly 28% of the adult population in the US and in Canada so that we can understand how those people are moving. Everything is de-identified and aggregated. So we're understanding how devices are moving, but not really how people are moving, and can give that information to you on your desktop so that you can quickly run an analysis, get information back in the form of interactive visualizations, or export that to a spreadsheet if you want to pull that into a modeling tool. So there's a variety of different applications, but it's opening up the way that people are moving, both, again, in cars, trucks, bicyclists, and pedestrians. How you might use it for bike ped is understanding where to put permanent bike counters. So if you're getting grants for putting in permanent bike counters, where do you put them? I went down to Florida most recently, worked with their statewide non-motorized conference, and everybody in the room was talking about bike counters, but nobody had an idea where to put them. There was all of us were on different panels, and everybody had a different opinion on where they should be investing to put these bike counters when you have very few to put out, but a lot of ground to cover. So prioritizing your efforts, understanding the trips that are happening today so you can plan for the future, those are all some of the things that we can do with Streetlight. And I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Julie. Wow. So that's both of those are really great foundational presentations to talk about the future. You know what pops into my mind? How many of you people live in the Triangle area? A lot of you. So do you remember when e-scooters showed up? So literally everywhere you looked, there was somebody on an e-scooter, usually under the age of 30, but other people were on them too, all over the place, on sidewalks, in the street, in the yard, everywhere. And then of course there was this huge collision in terms of government and the private sector. We were not ready for that technological advancement. Ryan, you were talking about the built environment and the physical environment not being ready for the changes in technology. So so it is really important for us to prepare and to be ready. So I guess my first question would be really for both of you. On the Ford side, what are you looking at? What do you see? What are the advancements in personal mobility that you all are preparing for? And Julie, for you, how will the collection of data today help inform decisions tomorrow about planning for those advancements? But Ryan, let's start with you.
Many caveats probably are appropriate, because if any of us can predict the future, we are in the, we're probably overly optimistic in our own abilities. But it's a lot of fun to speculate. So I'll join you in speculating. The scooter phenomenon is an interesting one, because we've seen things a little bit like that. Does anybody remember in the 1990s when rollerblades were a hot thing? Like, everybody had a pair of rollerblades. And you would see them on the street. I mean, there was hardly a block that you would walk down that there was usually like teenagers rollerblading. And then, like, now, how many people have gone rollerblading the last week? Probably not very many people. And so it's completely changed. And scooters were a little bit like that. So the question is, to what extent do they have staying power? Are they going to change the way that we move? And I think that there's some potential for that, because I think that there's going to be differentiation by trip length. And so in situations where there is infrastructure to support multimodal choices, I think that there's the strong possibility that something like scooters can start to peel off some of those trips that are less than a mile or less than 2 miles. 50% of trips are less than 3 miles that people make, right? And so taking some of those is not a huge problem, and all of those short trips cause congestion at the location that they're at, just like the longer trips do. And so I think that there's going to be differentiation by trip length, and so I think we're going to continue to see, and I don't know that the phenomenon is going to be things showing up overnight like scooters. I think that's much rarer, but it's probably more akin to the old adage about the frog who, when dropped in the boiling pot of water, jumps right out, but if you turn it up slowly, I think that's kind of the way the world usually operates. We don't notice change until you look back a decade or two. And I think that that's the sort of shifts that we're going to continue to see. And, so some of the things that I think about are continued evolution of vehicle form. I think that both within what are traditionally called cars, due to the influx of new technology, as well as electric capability, Ford is releasing its first electric car next year, and the form of those vehicles is going to start to look different. And I think that there's going to be more small vehicles like scooters, like e-bikes that take the world by storm. If we watch what's happening in Europe, which often is an indicator both for fashion and for society, a lot of times the trends seem to still, even now in the 21st century, flow from Europe to the United States, and they flow in the United States from the coasts inward, for better or for worse. It's the way it seems to work. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and it seemed like things happened in New York City about 6 to 7 years before they made it to my small town, and that seems to continue. And so in Europe, the e-bikes are outselling cars now, and that historically wasn't true. And so that's a new phenomenon there. In the last 2 to 3 years, it's passed by. And so we'll see. Will that happen in the United States? If everybody, I was actually at a friend's for dinner last night in downtown Durham, and his family owns 3 e-bikes. And they basically do all of their errands in the downtown area of Durham, and they use the bikes for that, right? And so they take their kids to school on the e-bike. And he does it because it's the easiest way to do it. It's the most cost-effective and easiest way to do it. And so I think that we'll see something like that, and that'll slowly start to percolate up to become something noticeable. There's 2 other things I would note. One is that I think that within the infrastructure, we're going to see that push to integrate digital technology. And so, if you're sitting out there with old controller boxes from the 1970s, they're not capable of doing some of the things that we want to have happen at an intersection, especially if we're starting to think multimodally. And so as the computing power in all of these infrastructure devices bumps up and as edge computing becomes possible, I think that we're going to see a shift in the way infrastructure shapes, and that'll allow things sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, to feel different. So I also think that asset light will be the way that a lot of people try and go, and edge computing allows that. Any one device is maybe just a few bucks, but you put hundreds of them together and you have real computing power. And that asset light approach will be much more nimble and allow us to turn over the infrastructure in a quicker cadence. The last thing I would note is just the way that we communicate between. So like we all can text each other, whether you're AT&T, Verizon, or Sprint or T-Mobile, we can all text each other. There's the communications protocol. That hasn't really existed in the transportation space. So there was this notion of DSRC dating back to the 90s, and it really hasn't been taken advantage of. And as we now move into what'll be 5G in the 2020s, I think that C-V2X is a communications protocol that will probably, in the end, prevail and will allow new capabilities in terms of the vehicles talking to each other in real time and the vehicles talking to the infrastructure around them, so the infrastructure reacts in real time. And I think that will really shift the feel of moving around. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things in addition to what you said, Ryan. Multimodal is something that we spend quite a bit of time on, is helping our customers deal with that. And how do you get people out of their cars, right? Everybody's dealing with that right now. Everybody wants to get more people on transit or other modes of transportation to alleviate congestion and just make the world a better place. So an example of how we might do that for our customers is up in Virginia, where I live in Northern Virginia, super congested, and it's a big area to scan. So where do you start? If you have 1,725 TAZs in Northern Virginia, you got to scan all of that. They came to us and they were working with Michael Baker and SSTI and VDOT, and we helped them scan the entire area of Northern Virginia and very quickly get back information on like how many trips were under 5, 3, or 1 miles. So first, which TAZs have the most short trips? A. And then B, within that, which one have the most under 5, 3, or 1 miles, so you can determine how do you use different mode share. What are candidates for transit? Where should we put some additional bike lanes in, and so forth? Or where could people be walking? Could we put a shuttle in to get more people that were doing things? And just in working with universities, another thing that we see is a lot of times you'll find a ton of really short trips under 1 mile. And what we found was people getting in the car with their roommate, driving around trying to find a place to park, then they drove all the way back home and ended up walking. So, what do you do with all that? Is solving those problems. And The way that you do that is understanding what the trips are today. How long are the trips? What is the simple trip purpose? What is the demographic of those trips? And we can help you with all of that as you're making decisions on it, how to change things in the future. Along with that, transportation travel demand models, when you're working with MPOs or DOTs, they are projecting what's going to happen in the future by looking what's happening today. So we're able to take the counts that they have and validate and calibrate that the counts that they have are accurate or if they're missing. And when I talked about coverage, especially in rural and local roads here in North Carolina, you have a lot of that where it may not make sense to put a permanent counter. Or if the counts you have are inaccurate or needed to be validated, we can give you an AEDT for virtually any road in your state. And along the lines with that, with safety and people with fatalities, people are more reluctant to send people out into the field to get those counts. And it's expensive. So we can give you those counts faster, cheaper, safer in many instances when you can't put a permanent bike counter or a permanent counter out there. So that's sort of how we're playing into the future of being able to help you plan for now, as well as plan for 5 years or 40 years in the future, and also deal with the different modes of transportation as new ones are coming out.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions here in a second. So be thinking about what you want to ask or talk about. But I'm struck, there are two things that sort of are rolling around in my head in terms of how the decisions we make in government today can, we have an obligation to meet the needs of today while also thinking about tomorrow. And that's a hard place to straddle. And I'm reminded, for those of you who don't know me, I'm on the Board of Transportation, and I've been on the board. This is my 4th term, so I've served 3 governors, and I'm a glutton for punishment, I'll just say. But early on in my tenure, in 2002, I remember being on the board and we were having this discussion about industrial park signage. And, there's issues around signage about, people have heard litter on a stick and all of that. And so you have to be careful about not having too much of that out there. And I remember bringing it up and saying, you know what, in the future, truckers aren't going to need a sign. They're just going to dial it into their GPS and they'll know how to get there. They don't need a sign to tell them how to get to an industrial park. And I remember a couple of board members looking at me like I was from Mars. Like, what are you talking about? That's never going to happen. Not that I'm any kind of soothsayer, but it was just an example of how hard it is for us sometimes to make these changes because we're so kind of, locked into the here and now and making these decisions in the here and now. Another example is I have a friend who's 58 and has a flip phone or had a flip phone. And something happened to it. This was just like in the last 3 weeks. Something happened to it. We went to the Verizon store and she said, I want another flip phone. And they said, well, you can get another flip phone. We do have a few of those, but they won't work next year. And I said, won't work next year? Why not? Not when we go to the 5G network. You'll have to have a smartphone. So sometimes all this stuff just leapfrogs over us. Things are happening so quickly that, we can resist, but that doesn't mean it's going to stop. It's going to happen. So how do we prepare? How can we stay current? I mean, that is our big challenge. So with that, let's open it up to the room. We've got 2 great experts here. Really want to hear from you. Questions, comments. Don't be shy. There you go.
Hi, I'm Sean Egan from the city of Durham. So I think it's really interesting to hear about all the data collection that's happening, but it seems like the data collection is very focused on vehicle throughput and vehicle miles traveled when we're really in the business of trying to move people as efficiently as possible. So how do we adapt those tools, those data collection tools, to be able to more effectively capture the movement of people and then also to prioritize movement of people in carpools, HOV, transit, where we have limited roadway space and we want to prioritize high occupancy vehicles? How do we use the data collection to do that?
Sure, and I guess like my first instinct is just to say you have to understand where people are moving today to understand that. So our solution and other solutions like ours give you an idea of what the trips are today. How many people are like if you want to understand movement along a corridor, how many people are moving in cars versus trucks, and how our system does that is through machine learning. So we look at the device and how fast the device is moving. Not only how many trips there are, but how fast that trip is moving. So we can put it into the appropriate bucket to whether that person is walking, whether they're biking, whether they're likely, if there's a bunch of people clumped in one, and they're probably on a bus together, or if they're in a truck or a vehicle. So understanding how those people are moving today and how long they're moving, where they're moving, why they're moving is going to help you make those decisions for the future. I don't know if it's going to incent them to get in a rideshare program or for them to carpool, but understanding where clumps of people are moving together and taking short trips is going to help you prioritize those decisions moving forward, in my opinion. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Raise your hand. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So I had a quick question about the data at Streetlight. So you mentioned that it replaces permanent count sites to accumulate ADT data. So if you have an app partnership with the apps and you have 28% of the population, I guess you're using AI to extrapolate and assume that it's times 4 or times 3.98 or 3.8 instead of having actual ADTs.
Well, we actually have an ADT count on virtually every road in the country because you're going to be able to get that for every day of the year versus we're never going to place permanent counters. That's always going to be your best choice. But for 1 and 2 day counts, that's really where it came directly from requests from the FHWA and DOTs saying that we need a faster, cheaper way to get this because the 1 and 2 day counts don't give me a total coverage of the entire population. So with us, it's the broader coverage, in particular for those rural and local roads where it's too cost prohibitive to put a permanent count. We're going to be able to give you a count on virtually every road in the community. And how we get those ADTs is from location-based services. The location-based services data gives that to us from cell phone devices. And how we validate that data is working with different DOTs across the country. We work with 17 different DOTs getting their ADT data. We pull that in, and so then we take out a testing set that's moved to the side, and then use the set for creating the ADT to use that with machine learning to learn how your ADT data works. And then when that's completed, we do it against the test set to look at the level of accuracy and then continue to tweak that and get that tighter and tighter.
Any other questions? Yes. We'll get a mic over there to you.
Good afternoon. John Auble from TomTom. I have a question for you about personal mobility. What is it? In 1970, 1920, 1980, we were worried about how long to get to work, how long to get to school, how far away are the shopping centers. We've always been worried about movement and where we can get to things. So today, 2020, is there a different definition of personal mobility that we're trying to get at here? Or are we just solving the same problems, but with different technology?
Great question. And I think that it's both. I think that it's the same classic thing. Like, we as humans need to move. We need to work with each other. And the distances have dialed up a little bit, though, right? So with each new technology comes the ability to travel further. So if you look back at the way metropolitan form has shifted over time, the area of your metropolitan area expands to accommodate the distance that you can travel via the new technology. And so if the speed of travel or the ease of travel is going up or down respectively, then you're going to have your shift, your area shaped by that. So because there's something called Marchetti's constant. So on average, humans are comfortable traveling about an hour a day. And so they'll travel that far out and that far back, so half an hour each way on average. The commute times in the United States are remarkably close to that, right, on average. And how far you can get in that then shapes the size of your community. And so in some ways, it's the same thing humans have always been doing. It's just that it looks different with different technology. But that need to move and that the abilities that moving allow is why we have an economy. We all need to talk to each other. We need to sell goods. And I think what's happening is that more and more of that is happening. Trip making is going up. And so we heard yesterday, and I agree with the perspective, the idea that there's probably going to be fewer personally owned vehicles, but more VMT. So more trips. So the easier the trips get, the more of them you take. And that's already true. We take far more trips now as individuals than we did 100 years ago. And that's for many things. One of them is we have far more pets. We walk our pets out and back, and that counts as a trip. And we get goods delivered to our doors. How many Amazon packages do you get in your household now versus 20 years ago, right? Those are all trips that are generated by you as an individual that we have to account for in our system. And so the number of trips, I think, is definitely going up, and I think that trend will continue.
I think another thing that's such a great question, because for so many people, people who are elderly, people who have some sort of disability and right now are limited in terms of their mobility. Some of these technologies, it's just going to open up so many worlds to people. So in some ways, technology is really going to expand personal mobility for the population, and of course that will have an impact on the infrastructure that we have to provide for it. Other questions? Get a mic over
Hey,
there. Okay.
Scott Cole with RSNH. My question is regarding counts as well. The department, we as professionals make a lot of decisions about turning movement counts and to a lesser extent ADTs.
Yep.
How can you give me a range? How close, how accurate are your turning movement counts?
Well, I can say for ADT, the root mean squared, I believe is like 0.97 for us, and that accuracy continues to tighten up. But for turning movements, I can send you a slide after we're done if you give me your card. Minnesota DOT has a regional subscription with us, which is basically all you can eat access to the platform, so they have unlimited use to the data. And they went out and they did a test in the field using their actual counts and then testing it against our turning movement counts, and the level of accuracy was pretty tight. So I have a slide that shows the percentages of that I can share with you or anybody else that wants to get those metrics from me. If you just come up and give me your card, I'll send you the slide. It was published by Minnesota DOT, and it's out on their website, so I have no connection to that. But it's pretty accurate, and you can basically, the way that you accomplish that is just basically when you're setting up an origin destination analysis, you can put just a virtual gate across each of those turning movements, across each of the directions to get how many people turn right versus left. Another application that for that would be is if you're in a high crash corridor, if you're having a lot of crashes from behind, a lot of the DOTs, Maryland DOT in particular, asked us to say, could we be able to see how many people are turning left in that high crash corridor to see if we had a dedicated left-hand turn lane, so that would alleviate and reduce crashes. So there's more than one application.
I'm just going to add, so there have been a few questions about counts, and I think that's fantastic. And I think that Julia and her company are doing a good job at getting that descriptive metric right, and I think we're able to do it better and better. But I would also encourage everyone to take just as close a look at the projections that are based on those counts. So you can get your count perfectly, and if the projection has an assumption that's off, you're going to be just as unreliable in terms of what it is that you're building for. And so I think that there's a few things that can be done. So back to the question that Mr. Egan asked at the very beginning, when you are thinking about multimodal, make sure that the travel demand model has that in it, right? So I don't know the status of the MPO's travel demand model here, but is it an activity-based model that can do all modes equally well and that is able to project out how many people are walking and biking just alongside the car, or is it very auto-centric, right? And so I think that you're going to get
a wider range of air if it's just one mode. And so it's just a slight exhortation to really think just as long and hard about the projection that you might be using as about the count. And I think that sometimes because the count is something that we can verify in the world, we spend a lot of time trying to get that perfect, and then we just plug it into the system and trust the system in terms of the projection. And that's kind of the wrong way to do it.
Good point. Questions, Ellen?
Over lunch, we were talking about the sea change we're projecting in transportation technology over the next 10 to 20 years. How do you feel we at the local and regional level should incorporate this into our planning so that we begin to try to get it right as to where we need to be 20 years from now as it relates to infrastructure?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I love this question, and the fact that you're even asking it shows the progressive nature, I think, of the community that we are in. I think that I just said one of the things that I think is of fundamental importance. I think you have to think in this era multimodally, and we can have differing opinions about what mode we should be using to commute to work or how prevalent a particular mode is going to be. But if the only thinking that is happening within your town or city's DOT or your state's DOT is about the car, they're missing most trips, right? And so we've done research in most of the cities across the country. More trips are taken out of the car than in the car, and that's because so many people walk to walk their pet. They don't drive to take their pet out. And that's because most people will walk to go to the thing that is. Now, that changes depending on, again, the morphology of the place that you're in. But no matter where you're at, you need to account for all types of trips. And I think that when you start to think like that, it helps. I think that then you should think and do the crazy notion of saying, is our government structured the right way for the era that we're in? It's a digital era, and it's a multimodal era. Right? And so is your DOT structured most effectively for where it's at? How many data scientists does the North Carolina DOT have? Or do they send that out to all the consultants to handle, right? And so are there new skill sets that are necessary to be the most progressive governance that you can possibly be? And I think that with that sort of re-examination of where you're at, and we've seen that shift already, right? Like, it's called the DOT. If you go back, I don't know how many decades ago it was here, but it was probably the Department of Highways, right? And states are continuing to make that transition. Nebraska just shifted 2 years ago. They were the Department of Roads, and now they're DOT, right? And that's a recognition that we're providing transportation and not just building roads for cars, right? And it has to be that broader, more societally wide approach that I think gets doubled down on in terms of how you structure your organization. One more little plug. We are working with NACDO, which is an organization that is for cities, on a new guidance document for how you should structure your city DOT to most effectively deliver transportation projects. It's going to be called Structured for Success. And it will be delivered next summer, 2020. There actually has not really been good existing guidance for city DOTs. There's a little bit at the state level. The Volpe Center, that's part of the US DOT, has done good work on developing guidance for state DOTs. And there's work that continues there. And I think, honestly, this guidance will be applicable both up and down in terms of the audience. But I would just watch for something like that. Like, how can we structure ourselves? Is our programming function in the DOT as effective as it could be and should be? Are we assigning dollars for construction to the projects that benefit the most people who have need, or are we just giving it to the people who are the noisiest at public meetings? And there's ways to screen that out within your programming process. And if your government function can do that, I think that that's a huge step forward that allows you to be reactive to new technologies in a more nimble fashion.
That's a great point. I'll just make one quick add-on to that. But just, again, understanding how people are moving around your community is going to help you better plan for what changes need to be made, who's underserved, things like accessibility, safety, but also just one thing that people might not know a lot about, but all of us are taking more and more Ubers, right? So what does gig driving look like? It's drastically different than an average driver. So we are working with different companies that do gig driving or TNC, like the Uber and Lyft drivers and so forth. by looking at the patterns, because if you look at how a person driving an Uber or Lyft is driving, it's radically different than any other driver. So how do you understand that, and how do you plan for that? So being able to understand all the next gen things that are coming and all the different modes of transportation and how they behave and how they behave with each other, that's really how we're playing into that and helping you plan for the future.
I'll add one more thing. A lot of people ask us, like, what is the one thing we as a city should be doing to prepare for tomorrow? And there's many good answers, but I think that one of the easiest and simplest, but not necessarily politically easiest, is curbside space. So for whether it's delivering goods, so UPS, FedEx, Amazon, or if it's pick up and drop off due to Uber and Lyft, there's going to be a requirement, which I think are a harbinger of the way that transportation behavior may be with AVs. All of those require curbside space, and very few cities across the country have enough curbside space to accommodate that. So what happens? You've seen it in your communities here, I'm sure. They double park. They pull over just right into the lane where they're at and put on the flashers, and they either deliver the packages or you hop out, hopefully on the right side of the car if you're going there in a TNC. And that's not the safest situation. And so, one easy, quick thing would be, say, in this region, we're going to make sure that every community does a real understanding of the amount of curbside space that they should dedicate. And it should be throughout the city. The city of New York City is doing a new thing. They just announced it this summer, where they're going to have a curbside loading space for freight delivery in every residential neighborhood within 2 or 3 blocks. So there's a spot for a 2 or 3 block area where the delivery person knows to pull, and they can do all their deliveries. And USPS can use it. And you could do pick up and drop off people there if the freight delivery weren't there. But guess what? The residents have come out really upset about it, because how do you get curbside space? You have to take away an existing parking space, free car storage space that we're giving to our citizens, usually for free in residential areas. And so that's a politically tricky thing sometimes, but I think you can see the importance in terms of safety and just function of the overall transportation system. And so if you can illustrate and articulate those trade-offs to your citizenry, usually I think that they will understand. But that's a very simple example. Any new development that's going in, the development review should be considering where pickups and drop-offs will be happening, right? And those are simple changes that we can do right now that I think will pay off.
Just think about that. Yes, I want to point out we've got David Howard, who is our Deputy Secretary. For those of you who worry that NCDOT is falling behind, I want to give you assurance that we're leading, and David is leading, just technology-driven, innovation-driven. So proud of the work that David's brought to the department.
Now I don't feel like what I'm going to say is will live up to that, Nina.
Okay.
First thing I wanted to just reiterate on what you were just talking about. Having been an elected official in Charlotte, you're correct. We were dealing with curbside. It gets to be a little easier when you get out into the neighborhoods, but in the urban core, especially middle of the day, we had complaints because those delivery trucks want to park on the curbs and they're taking away lanes where people are trying to get to work. So you got a lot to do with just managing, just not where they are, but when they can park there as well. There's a whole timing thing that you have to do as well. Just to let you know what we're doing in North Carolina, and I don't see Hannah or Julie. I kept looking for their heads, and I don't see them. In North Carolina, under Julie White, who's our Deputy Secretary of Multimodal Transportation, and Hannah Cockburn, who's over a new division that we're calling Integrated Mobility Division. We put our bike ped division with our public transportation division for exactly what you're talking about, which is the citizen doesn't really care. I mean, that last mile, first mile, get me where I'm going without a car is one long conversation. It's not separate conversations. And we were pointing the fingers kind of saying, well, this is yours, this is yours. And nobody knew what to do with the scooters. I mean, is that public transportation? Is that bike ped? Is it a bike? What is it? Well, how about we just put all of it together and say when it comes to individual mobility, we'll have one division looking at how that whole continuum works. Now, and if any of those staff people in this room, they'll tell you we're still struggling with trying to figure out how to pull the money together, because money comes from FTA, money comes from federal highways. It doesn't mix real well. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we have one conversation about what happens from the time you leave your door to wherever you're going if you're not in the automobile right now in the state of North Carolina. nobody knows what integrated mobility is. It's a great time to kind of say it's what used to be public transportation and what used to be bike paired in North Carolina. We're trying to have one conversation. So just wanted you to know we're trying to do that in North Carolina right now.
And whatever the future might be.
And whatever that is,
new modes.
we know there will be something else new, and we want to be prepared for it.
We have a few more minutes for, one more minute for questions. Yes, ma'am.
One more question.
One more question.
I guess the cost of personal mobility for disadvantaged groups is heavily subsidized by various FTA, FWA programs. So as we move forward in the future, and yesterday's conversation talked about the fee per vehicle miles trip, but now if someone can't afford a $2 bus ride, that'll take you, whether you go 1 mile or 10 miles, how is the future and will become more affordable for disadvantaged groups?
I'll just make one quick comment and give it to Ryan because I can see he's got something to say. More and more cities, are moving to free transit. I don't know if you guys have seen that in the public, but was it Kansas City that was one of the first that went to free transit. So that's something that I would certainly encourage. I'm sure everybody else in the room would as well. I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
I think it's a great point, and frankly, I think it's a nice way to bookend this conversation because that is an important issue that is not going away. The poor will always be with us, right? And there's and that's not an endorsement of the way things are. I think it's actually a call to have much greater empathy in our systems, right? And so I think that how equity is built into, especially if more transportation is provided from private side operators, is a really important consideration. And you have to have, whether there's subsidies for ride making or whether there is, as Julie just noted, broad scale free access to particular modes. I think that's an important thing. So I'm partial to spin, of course, in the scooter conversation, and it's something that we've contemplated in the environments that we've gone into with our scooter company, is how do you provide really, I think, equivalent access throughout the community. So number one, it's in placement, making sure that that's available everywhere. And we haven't always historically done a very good job of making sure that all modes are available everywhere, especially non-auto and sometimes in the history of auto as well. But there are various incentives that we can do to make sure that the benefits of new personal mobility technology are widespread and equitably available. And it's something that we're trying to design into our system. And I will just say this, we actually have active right now in a lab that we have in Palo Alto, California, a research project looking at how can we more equitably distribute our e-scooters via spin. And there are various things that the research is turning up that some of them are tried and true techniques for providing equitable access, and others are, I think, interesting innovations. And finding those right carrots to make sure that people are aware and that you're communicating broadly to the entire community as you're making new transportation offerings is really important and something that I know I care very deeply about. So thanks for raising that issue. And I think it's a call to action for all of us to make sure that we remember that as we're implementing transit improvements and personal mobility improvements throughout this region.
Thank you both so much for what is really turned out to be a great conversation. Please join me in thanking them for that. Gosh, there's just so much to think about for all of us in terms of really keeping North Carolina front and center in this discussion. I want to leave us with a quote from Henry Ford. Yeah, you've heard of him. And really, when you think about it, I've just been thinking, this is the Ford Auto Company. And what we have been hearing about is about transportation and mobility, not just the automobile. So it's just, things have changed so radically. But Henry Ford, a lot of you probably heard this quote, but I think it's important, a good one to end on, which is, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So we think we can, and we must do this so that we prepare North Carolina for the future. So go out and do good things, and thank you for being here today.